So picture this, an endless, perfectly straight line of people.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, they're walking blindly, just shuffling forward in near darkness, following the echo of this mysterious, disembodied voice.
Sounds, pretty intense.
Oh, it gets worse. All around them, millions of people are whispering in absolute terror.
Right.
Their faces are completely frozen in fear, and they're looking up at this giant looming throne that just stretches across the entire sky.
That is some heavy imagery.
Right. And right in the middle of all this apocalyptic dread, you have a prophet Moses, specifically, sweating under the pressure, and he's being sternly told to stop reading too fast.
I mean, it genuinely sounds like a surrealistic painting. Or, maybe the climax of a Gothic horror novel written back in the Middle Ages.
It really does.
Yeah.
It is incredibly cinematic, but also terrifying. And for those of you listening who are familiar with the traditional interpretations of these specific ancient verses, this is the classic, eerie description of Judgment Day.
Yeah, the standard narrative.
Exactly. For centuries, this spooky doomsday imagery has been the absolute default way people picture the end of the world. Just, absolute ghost-like terror, trembling before a cosmic judge.
Which is exactly why we have to halt everything and reframe this conversation immediately for you today.
Oh, we're diving right in, huh?
We have to. I actually have to laugh. And, not out of disrespect, but out of sheer disbelief whenever we encounter these hyper-literal translations.
Because then what's the point?
Entirely. Because what we are looking at are clearly highly metaphorical, highly technical texts. So this spooky doomsday imagery you just described, it is entirely a mythological placeholder.
Okay, hold on. That is a massive leap.
I know it sounds like it.
No, you were taking centuries of accepted theological imagery and just casually calling it a placeholder?
Well, yeah, because it is.
But what linguistic or contextual evidence allows us to make the jump from literal ghosts and terrifying thrones to anything else? Because to the average listener, that sounds like you're just, rewriting the text to make it sound less scary.
That is a very fair challenge, and it's the exact hurdle this text demands we clear.
So how do we clear it?
Well, the text we are doing a deep dive into today, specifically looking at Surah 20, verses 107 through 114, is simply not a horror story.
Okay.
The linguistic roots of the Arabic used here, when you actually understand them in their classical 7th century idiomatic context, are not describing a spooky afterlife event.
What are they describing?
They are detailing a brilliant, advanced breakdown of cognitive science, epistemological discipline, and data processing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it is describing the absolute triumph of objective truth over human opinion.
Okay, you're going to have to walk me through the mechanics of that. How do we get from a line of terrified people walking toward a throne to data processing and systemic justice?
Think about what a mythological placeholder does in human history.
Like, historically speaking.
Exactly. When a society loses the capacity to understand the complex social physics of a text, when they literally forget how the mechanics of economics, law, and cause and effect operate, they replace those mechanics with mythology.
Oh, I see. So they substitute the math for a story.
Right. They take the concept of inevitable systemic consequences and turn it into, a giant man on a throne who is very angry.
Because that's easier to grasp.
Exactly. It's easier to be scared of a ghost than it is to take responsibility for the macroeconomic structures of your society.
So you're saying that over time, the real mathematical warning of these verses was essentially dumbed down into a ghost story.
Yes, because the actual science of it was too intellectually demanding for a deteriorating society.
That makes a terrifying amount of sense.
And in this deep dive, examining Lecture 11 out of 14 from this specific series of analytical notes, we are going to strip away all that superstitious baggage.
We are getting to the source code.
Precisely. The verses are detailing what happens when empirical, systemic reality drops into an environment. It's about what happens to entrenched power, fake theories, and PR spin when an objective baseline of truth is fully established.
So we're moving entirely out of the realm of mythology.
Right. We are stepping firmly into the realm of social physics.
Okay, if we are truly bypassing the ghostly terror and looking at this as a blueprint for a functioning society, let's look at the first major obstacle the text tackles.
Which is the demolition.
Exactly. It starts with a demolition. In Surah 20, verses 105 to 107, the text asks what will happen to the, quote, mountains.
A very loaded word.
And the answer it gives is that they will be blasted into dust. leaving a perfectly level plain. The Arabic term used here is Qan Safa.
Right, a perfectly leveled field.
Yeah, and the verse explicitly says there will be absolutely no unevenness, which is emta, and no crookedness, which is iwaja.
To understand the demolition, you really have to understand the architecture being described.
Okay, unpack the architecture for us.
In the linguistic environment of 7th century Arabic, particularly in the socio-political context of these verses, mountains do not mean literal rocks, geology, or tectonic plates.
So we aren't talking about the Alps or the Himalayas just randomly crumbling.
No, not at all. Look at the historical context the text is addressing. It frequently references figures like Pharaoh or the tribal oligarchy of the Quraysh in Mecca.
Right, the ruling classes.
Yes. These entities were the mountains of their time. The term referred to entrenched power structures.
Like the mega wealthy.
Massive wealth hoarders. Oppressive, tyrannical regimes that literally towered over the average person. They cast a massive shadow, they controlled the flow of resources, they dictated the entire narrative.
And so to the common person on the ground, they seemed as permanent and immovable as a literal mountain.
Exactly, you couldn't imagine moving them.
Well, if we translate that out of antiquity and apply it to the modern era for you listening today, we obviously aren't dealing with pharaohs building pyramids anymore.
No, but the structural equivalent is everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at massive global tech conglomerates that control all our data flows, or entrenched political dynasties, or Wall Street monopolies, they act exactly like those immovable mountains.
They really do. They are the modern mountains.
They're constantly called too big to fail. They dictate the weather of our entire economy.
And the psychological impact on the average citizen today is exactly the same as it was 3,000 years ago.
Just a feeling of complete powerlessness.
Yes, a feeling of powerlessness in the shadow of this massive, untouchable structure. So the text poses the ultimate hypothetical.
Which is?
What happens to these dynastic monopolies when a system of absolute objective justice is fully established?
And the answer the text gives is pretty violent to the status quo.
Very. They are blasted into dust. The playing field is entirely leveled into a Khan Safsafa.
Wait, let me push back on the mechanics of this. Blasted into dust sounds like violent revolution.
I can see why you'd think that.
Are we talking about a literal armed uprising here? Because historically, when you dynamite a mountain of power through sheer force, it just creates a massive power vacuum.
Right. And historically, a new, often more brutal mountain just rises in its place.
Exactly. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
That is the critical distinction we have to make here. The text is not advocating for chaotic, violent anarchy to just tear down the rich.
So it's not a peasant revolt?
No. It is describing the mathematical result of implementing an objective legal and economic framework.
Okay, so a structural shift, not a physical one.
Right. The blasting isn't done with swords or artillery. It is done through the relentless application of transparency and equitable law.
How does transparency blast a mountain?
To understand how that works, we have to look at the two words that follow in the verse. Iwaja and amta.
Okay, crookedness and unevenness. Let's dig into those.
Let's start with iwaja, which implies ideological or political crookedness. It is the deception, the legal loopholes, the exploitation, and the systemic gaslighting that is intentionally built into corrupt systems.
So Iwaja is essentially the PR spin and the armies of corporate lawyers.
Exactly.
It's that fine print at the bottom of the terms and conditions that allows a massive corporation to legally steal your data while simultaneously convincing you they are doing you a massive favor.
That is the perfect modern example. It is the entire industry of obfuscation.
Making things blurry on purpose.
Yes. Think about how much energy, capital, and time in our modern political landscape is spent just navigating this crookedness.
Oh, billions of dollars.
The backroom lobbying, the hidden agendas, the dark money super PACs. All of that relies on a landscape that is intentionally difficult to navigate.
Okay, and what about the second word, AMTA?
AMTA is the structural result of that crookedness. It literally means unevenness.
Like valleys and peaks.
Right. In social physics, it represents the deep, devastating valleys of poverty sitting right next to the artificial stratospheric peaks of hoarded wealth.
But listen, PR spin, lying, and exploiting loopholes are basically foundational to human nature at this point.
Sadly, yes.
So are we realistically saying a legal framework can eradicate human deception? How is this level plane, this Qan Safsafa, not just some utopian science fiction?
Because it relies on the architecture of the system itself. not on the moral perfection of every single individual human being.
Okay, I need an analogy for that.
Think about a mountainous landscape. Things can easily hide in the valleys. Corrupt, backroom deals happen in the shadows of the peaks.
Sure, shadows provide cover.
But on a perfectly level plane, there is absolute transparency. There is literally nowhere to hide the crookedness.
Because the sun hits everything equally.
Exactly. If the economic and legal rules are objectively and universally applied, meaning the CEO is subject to the exact same rigorous empirical standard as a janitor, with absolutely no exceptions, the mountain cannot sustain its own weight.
Oh, I see. A monopoly cannot exist without the shadows of Iwaja to protect it.
Right. When the law provides nowhere to hide, the mountain collapses into dust naturally. It just can't stand.
Man, that is a profound way to look at systemic justice.
It really is.
So if we truly level the economic playing field and eliminate those dark valleys where corruption hides, what happens to the propaganda used to justify that inequality?
That is the next logical step.
Because entrenched power doesn't just rely on money, right?
Yeah.
It relies on very loud narratives, telling people that the unevenness is natural or that it's just the way things are or that the market demands it.
Propaganda is the glue of the mountain.
Exactly. And it can't survive in the light. Which brings us to a fascinating concept in the text regarding the silencing of those narratives.
This takes us directly to verse 108.
Right. The verse states that people will follow the caller who has no crookedness, no iwaja at all.
A completely straight line.
And it says all voices will be humbled before the divine system. The Arabic phrase is kashatil aswatu.
Humbled voices.
Yeah, and what is left in the aftermath is nothing but a faint whisper or the sound of footsteps, which the text calls hamsa.
And here we return right back to the Gothic horror imagery we started the show with.
Oh, right.
Traditionally, all voices, humbled in faint whispers, was interpreted as trillions of terrified souls trembling in the dark, too afraid to speak before a wrathful deity on Judgment Day.
Just absolute cosmic stage fright.
Right. But if we maintain our systemic cognitive analysis, humbled voices has to mean something functional, not just emotional.
So what is the function of the silence?
It means something radically profound for societal functioning. When empirical systemic reality drops into a society, when the Khan Safsafa is established and transparency is absolute, all the fake political theories, the loud ideological propaganda, and theological fairy tales are instantly neutralized into silence.
So the hushed voices represent the collapse of false narratives.
Exactly, because you don't need to shout to defend the truth. The truth simply is. It is empirically verifiable.
It speaks for itself.
Yes. It's the lies that require the megaphone. It's the artificially constructed mountains that require a 24/7 news cycle of spin to convince the public that the mountain is actually a good thing.
There is a really compelling analogy in the lecture notes we were studying today.
Oh, the mother analogy.
Yeah. He compares this sudden systemic silence to a mother hushing a noisy house because a baby is sleeping.
I love that one.
Me too, because it completely shifts the motivation. It is not a silence of terror. It is a silence of profound care and systemic mercy.
The systemic nature of mercy actually requires the eradication of noise.
How so?
Well, think about the sensory experience of a deeply unjust society. The noise of exploitation is deafening.
Oh, yeah.
The grinding machinery of poverty is loud. The artificial political outrage generated by propaganda is incredibly loud.
It's exhausting.
It is a chaotic, disorienting environment that prevents any real human potential from growing.
So the silence is necessary for growth.
Yes. The silencing of those voices, kasha'at al-aswatu, is an absolute prerequisite for human flourishing. The mother hushes the chaotic noise so the fragile potential of the infant can develop safely.
That is beautiful.
Yeah.
But I want to explore the real-world mechanism of this silence.
Sure, let's unpack it.
If all the spin is effectively silenced, does that mean the people who used to shout the loudest on their megaphones, the pundits, the spin doctors, the propagandists, are suddenly completely powerless?
Basically, yes.
Do they just give up?
They don't really have a choice because their tool no longer works in the new environment.
The environment rejects the tool.
Exactly. The text introduces the concept of the caller who has no crookedness. Now, this caller isn't a guy standing on a street corner with a loudspeaker.
Right.
It represents a system of absolute clarity. It is an objective, transparent, operational standard.
So it's a baseline of truth.
Yes. In an environment of absolute empirical truth, the deafening noise of propaganda simply cannot exist because it has nothing to bounce off of. It has no shadows to hide in.
It's like trying to run a massive disinformation campaign asserting that the sky is neon green when every single person in the room is standing outside looking up in a clear blue sky.
Exactly.
The propagandists can open their mouth, but the environment itself mutes them. The empirical evidence overrides the spin instantaneously.
That is the perfect visualization of the caller. The system's transparency makes the lie structurally impossible to sustain.
Wow.
And this raises an incredibly uncomfortable question for a very specific subset of people in society.
Which people?
What happens to the individuals who built their entire identities and their entire financial empires on that noise?
Oh boy. The people who assumed that when the consequences finally caught up with them, they could just talk their way out of it.
Right. The ones who assume the rules are always negotiable if you just know the right people or say the right magical words.
Which seamlessly moves us into the psychological delusion of the VIP pass.
A very dangerous delusion.
Seriously. Because if you can't spin your way out of the consequences, maybe you can just call in a favor.
And this is where the text performs a surgical strike on one of the most deeply held superstitions in human history.
Specifically in verse 109, we are talking about the concept of shafa.
Shafa. An incredibly loaded term.
Extremely. Traditionally, across centuries of theology, it is almost universally translated as intercession.
And we need to completely shred that traditional definition right now.
Let's do it.
Because the way it is commonly understood is basically a magical bypass.
It's the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card.
It's the highly superstitious belief that a person can act terribly their entire life. They can hoard wealth, oppress vulnerable populations, lie, cheat, and extract from the system.
Just be a completely toxic entity.
Exactly. And yet, they believe they can still get out of facing the consequences at the end.
How?
Because a saint or a prophet or some spiritual VIP will supposedly step in, whisper in the cosmic judge's ear, and say, hey, he's with me. Let him off the hook.
It is literal cosmic nepotism.
That's exactly what it is. It is projecting the worst, most corrupt aspects of earthly political systems onto the fabric of the universe.
But wait, let me play the skeptic here for the listener.
Go for it.
Isn't the whole point of spiritual traditions to offer hope to flawed people?
That's the argument, yeah.
If we remove this bypass, if there is no intercession, no savior figure who can vouch for you, aren't we just left with a cold, unforgiving machine? Doesn't this destroy the entire concept of mercy?
It destroys a corrupt definition of mercy to establish a systemic one.
Okay, explain the difference.
Think about it this way. If a structural engineer uses cheap, faulty materials to build a bridge because he wants to pocket the extra cash.
Embezzlement.
Right. And that bridge inevitably collapses and harms people, do you want the judge to forgive him just because they happen to be members of the same country club?
No, obviously not. That would be insane.
Why not?
Because that mercy to the corrupt engineer is profound cruelty to the victims who are on the bridge.
Exactly. True justice cannot accommodate arbitrary bypasses. The text completely dismantles the idea of intercession. It defines shafa systemically not as a favor, but as a strict compatibility check.
Let's build out the mechanics of this compatibility check, because this is a massive paradigm shift.
It changes everything.
How does an objective framework actually measure a human being's compatibility?
Let's use a tech analogy. Think of the universe, the divine law of cause and effect, as an ultimate, perfect operating system.
Okay, OS universe.
Right. And it runs on specific code.
Mm.
Justice, equity, human development.
The permanent values.
Yes. Now think of an individual human personality as a piece of software. You write the code of your software every single day through your actions, your choices, and how you treat others.
So every decision is a line of code.
Exactly. Shafa is the moment your software tries to boot up in the new operating system.
Oh, wow. So if your actions in life didn't develop your personality to align with the permanent values of the system,
your code is fundamentally broken.
you're incompatible.
Yes. The text uses a very specific phrase. Radiallahu qualla.
What does that translate to?
It means your state or your word must be acceptable to the system. It must be compatible.
So if you spent your life writing code based on exploitation, cruelty, and deceit,
your software is essentially malicious. It will crash.
it just won't run.
It will not run on an operating system based on absolute justice and transparency.
So you cannot act horribly your whole life and expect a VIP pass at the end just because you know the bouncer.
No.
The system doesn't run on nepotism, it runs on source code.
And there is no software patch for a life of exploitation.
No quick updates you can download at the last second.
None. There is no backdoor bypass. No saint, prophet, or religious figure can intercede to make incompatible code suddenly run smoothly.
That makes total sense.
The analytical notes point out that in a truly just system, defense witnesses, the Arabic term used is wakali, can only testify based on empirical facts.
They can't just be character witnesses.
Right. They cannot offer emotional pleas.
You know, in modern human courtrooms, a defense attorney can sometimes sway a jury with a really emotional, tear-jerking narrative, even if the defendant is blatantly guilty.
We see it all the time.
They bring up a tough childhood, or they talk about how the defendant does charity work on the weekends, just to distract from the actual crime.
But the cosmic ledger, the objective social physics of the universe, does not respond to emotional manipulation.
It's immune to it.
Completely immune. It responds to data, the raw data of your actions.
So you are entirely responsible for the data you input into your own personality.
Yes. Shafa isn't someone begging for your forgiveness. It is the objective alignment of your developed self with ultimate reality.
It's just a diagnostic test.
Exactly. If the alignment is there, you integrate successfully. If it isn't, you are rejected by the system itself, not by some angry judge.
Man, that is mathematically precise. And honestly, it is vastly more terrifying, but also significantly more empowering than the mythological version.
Because it puts the power in your hands.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can't bribe the system, but you also are in total control of writing your own code every single day. No one can write it for you.
Which logically forces us to ask the next big question.
What kind of code are we supposed to be writing?
Precisely. What kind of society is that compatible software actually meant to build?
And that brings us to the core of how human potential is activated and how the text demands the absolute eradication of two massive societal viruses.
Zulm and Hadam.
Yes. We are looking closely at verses 111 and 112 now.
Let's get into it.
The text states that faces will be humbled. The phrase is, anatil wuju, to the living and sustaining system.
Right.
And whoever carries zulm will fail, while those who do righteous work will not fear zulm or hedem.
Let's start with a linguistic breakdown of wuju, which is usually translated literally as faces.
Right, like physical faces.
But in the idiomatic Arabic of the text, faces is a synecdoche. It refers to human potentialities.
Like the essence of a person.
Yes, it represents the total human personality, the complete sum of our capabilities, our intellect, and our ambitions.
Okay, so when the text says these potentials humble themselves, anatil wuju, we have to strip away the image of people walking around with their heads hanging down in shame or subservience.
Exactly the opposite. In this context, to humble oneself to a life-giving, sustaining program means that potential is finally actualized.
So it's plugged in.
It is plugged into the right socket. Think of a massive, powerful river.
Okay.
If it runs wild and unchecked, it floods, erodes the soil, and destroys everything in its path.
It's just raw, destructive energy.
But if that river humbles itself to the structure of a hydroelectric dam, its raw potential is actualized into massive, sustaining energy for millions of people.
That is a brilliant mechanical analogy. The human potential is actualizing itself by aligning with the systemic loss.
Exactly.
But to do that, the system has to guarantee certain protections. You can't ask human beings to plug their potential into a society if that society is designed to just drain them dry.
Which is where most societies fail.
Right. And this is where we get into eradicating exploitation.
Yeah.
The text guarantees that a compatible constructive society will never allow zulm or hadam.
Let's define those terms systemically because they are literally the root of almost every modern economic crisis.
Okay, start with zulm.
Zulm is fundamentally about distorting equity. The root meaning is to place something where it does not belong.
Like an imbalance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is taking what is not yours, denying someone what is rightfully theirs, or creating a severe imbalance in the social equilibrium.
And hadam.
Hadam is specifically the devaluation of human labor.
Okay.
It is usurping rights. It is the systemic exploitation that allows one person or entity to digest the labor, time, and caloric energy of another human being without giving fair and equitable compensation.
Let's make this incredibly concrete for the listener.
Yeah.
Give me the mechanism of hadam in reality. I know the lecture notes provide a very grounded example of a day laborer.
Yeah, let's use that one. Imagine early morning at a crossroads in a major city. There's a crowd of daily wage laborers sitting there, tools in hand, waiting for someone to hire them.
Just looking for a day's work.
A contractor pulls up in a truck. He needs 10 workers for a brutal, heavy construction job.
Hard physical labor.
Right. Now, he knows the objective, fair wage for a day's back-breaking labor, enough to feed a family and sustain the worker's health is, let's say, $100.
That's the baseline of equity.
But he looks at the crowd, he sees there are 50 men there, he knows they are desperate, he knows they have hungry kids at home.
And he leverages that desperation against them.
Yes. He says, I have 10 spots, but I'm only paying $50 for the day. Who wants it?
Oh, wow.
And out of sheer survival instinct, the men undercut each other until 10 of them agree to work for a fraction of what their labor is actually worth.
It's not just the guy on the corner in a pickup truck, though.
No, it happens on a macro scale.
If we extrapolate this impartially to macroeconomics, it is the multinational corporation that shifts its production to a country with zero labor protections, paying people pennies a day to assemble a smartphone that sells for over $1,000.
Exactly.
The corporation is literally digesting the lifespan of that foreign worker. But how does this objective system we're discussing actually prevent it?
Well, let's look at how current models handle it.
Right, because pure market capitalism generally assumes the free market will naturally correct the value of labor based on supply and demand.
And this ancient text completely rejects that premise.
Really?
Yes. It argues that human labor has an intrinsic, unalterable value that the market is not allowed to negotiate down based on human desperation.
So desperation can't be a pricing factor.
Never. That is Haddam. It is the literal definition of devaluing labor. Taking the raw caloric energy and sweat of a human being and consuming it without equitable compensation is a massive violation of social physics.
It crashes the OS.
Exactly. The systemic justice outlined in these verses outlaws this completely. You cannot digest someone else's labor to pad your profit margins.
So in this leveled playing field, this Khan Safsafa, whether you are looking at it through the lens of modern free market capitalism or historical state-run communism, this text is essentially arguing for an absolute baseline where the literal exchange of human effort is never compromised.
It strips away all the ideological labels.
It just looks at the math.
Right. The text doesn't care if you call your economic system a free market or a workers' collective. It looks at the mechanics and asks one question. Are you digesting the labor of the vulnerable?
And if you are?
If the answer is yes, you are carrying zulm. And the verse explicitly says, whoever carries zulm will fail. Period. It is a mathematical certainty.
Because it violates the fundamental physics of the system.
Exactly.
Which requires us to look at how those physics actually operate over time. We've talked about the immediate action of exploitation, but what about the long-term consequences?
This brings us to verse 110, which contains one of the most profound statements on causality in the entire text.
Let's hear it.
The translation is, he knows what is before them and behind them, but they do not encompass it in knowledge.
Now, I have to challenge this because on the surface, this just sounds like a basic theological statement about omniscience.
God knows everything, past and future.
Exactly. God knows everything humans don't. That's standard dogma in almost every single religion. What is new or revolutionary about this?
What's revolutionary is when you translate it out of dogma and into the language of social physics.
Okay, translate it for me.
What is before them and behind them is not just about a deity passively watching events on a timeline. It refers to the entire unbroken chain of cause and effect in a closed system.
Explain the mechanism of a closed information loop in society.
It is the law of requital. It is the fundamental principle that every single action, every political policy, every economic choice has a precise, unavoidable reaction within the system.
So there are no isolated incidents?
None. Nothing is lost in the ether. Nothing is forgotten by the mathematics of the universe.
So every economic policy that extracted wealth from the middle class 30 years ago,
Yeah.
every social extraction, every intellectual deception spread through mass media,
Yes.
it is all recorded in the physical deterioration of that civilization over time.
Exactly. It is a cosmic ledger.
Wow.
But the crucial part of the verse, the real warning, is the second half. But they do not encompass it in knowledge.
Meaning humans are blind to it.
Yes. Human beings have massive, terrifying blind spots when it comes to time and causality. We are temporally and spatially limited. We only see the immediate effects of our actions.
We see what's right in front of our faces.
Right. A government enacts an exploitative economic policy today. It looks great for the next quarterly earnings report. GDP goes up temporarily, and the politicians declare it a massive success.
Re-election guaranteed.
Exactly.
But the consequences of that zulm, that distortion of equity, might not manifest fully for 50 years.
The lag time is the killer.
When a society finally collapses decades later, modern politicians call it a black swan event or unforeseen circumstances. We blame market volatility or global trends or just bad luck
But the system sees exactly what caused it.
because the system encompasses the whole timeline.
Right. What we call unforeseen circumstances is really just the compounding interest of uncorrected Zulm. We simply lack the processing power to see the infinite chain of cause and effect. We can't see the 50-year lag time.
Because our data sets are so deeply flawed and our vision is so incredibly short-term, we are structurally prone to making terrible decisions while being absolutely convinced we're doing the right thing.
Which is the exact reason why a society cannot survive if it relies solely on its own limited, short-term empirical data to create its moral compass.
We need a wider lens.
We must anchor our societies to an unchanging, objective benchmark of justice provided by the overarching system.
So the principles have to be absolute.
Yes. If the objective law says, do not engage in Hadam, do not usurp labor, you do not do it, even if your most brilliant economists present a short-term model showing it will boost national profits.
Because that profit is a toxic illusion.
Because the system knows what is before and behind, and it knows that Hadam will eventually, inevitably, collapse the society.
We have to trust the macro-level physics of the system because we can only see the micro-level variables.
Perfectly said.
But navigating those variables, especially when our own brains want to leap to conclusions, requires a very specific type of mental training.
Which leads us directly to the psychological command in Ayat 114, Wala tajal bil Qurani.
This phrase is often translated as, do not rush with the compilation, or do not rush with the reading before it is completed.
Yes, that's the standard translation.
On the surface, it sounds like an instruction to an individual prophet not to speak too quickly while receiving a message.
But in the broader context of cognitive science and epistemology, this is a direct, brilliant warning against confirmation bias.
Oh, that is fascinating.
It is a command against emotional, knee-jerk conclusions.
It's the ultimate demand for intellectual rigor. The text is demanding that we do not form our final conclusion based on an incomplete data set.
Exactly.
We cannot take an isolated verse or an isolated fact and rush to build an entire ideological system around it before we have integrated the whole picture.
Look at how information is consumed and weaponized today. We live in an attention economy that actively rewards the fastest reaction, not the most accurate one.
Hot takes rule the world.
The algorithm punishes you if you wait for all the facts. Modern political commentators, algorithms, religious zealots, they all operate on the exact opposite of Wala tajal.
They find one single data point, one quote taken wildly out of context, one 15-second video clip stripped of its preceding event.
And they weaponize it immediately.
Right, they build a whole narrative, a whole movement around a fragment.
They rush the reading. They succumb to the tyranny of unproven assertions. The systemic command here demands an absolute halt. It requires you to stop until the entire picture is assembled, verified, and cross-referenced.
The lecture notes use a great agricultural metaphor here. You cannot plant a field of wheat today and then stand there demanding a harvest in 3 months just because you are hungry.
Right. You can't rush biology, and you can't rush truth.
Systemic truth requires patience. It requires allowing the process of verification to run its full course.
The human mind naturally craves quick answers. It's a survival mechanism. We want closure. We want to categorize things immediately as good or bad, true or false, friend or enemy.
It conserves cognitive energy.
But objective truth, especially when dealing with the complex social macro dynamics of a civilization, resists that kind of impatience.
So when the verse ends with the phrase, "Increase me in knowledge, Rabbi Zidni Ilma," it's not just a cute pious prayer to mumble before taking a test.
Not at all.
It is the ultimate scientific disclaimer.
It is the foundation of the scientific method applied to social ethics.
It's like a scientist publishing a groundbreaking, world-changing paper, but ending the conclusion by admitting their data is still limited and explicitly keeping their mind open to future discoveries.
Exactly.
How crucial is that intellectual humility for the listener today, especially in an era of absolute information overload?
It is the only way to survive an era of information overload without losing your mind or becoming a tool for someone else's propaganda.
It's a defense mechanism.
The lecture notes compare this mindset to brilliant modern thinkers. It specifically mentions J.W.N. Sullivan, the science writer.
What did he say?
He noted that despite all of humanity's incredible, staggering scientific discoveries, a true scientist must admit that the ultimate truth is still vast and waiting to be understood.
You have to keep saying, increase me in knowledge.
Always.
Because the exact moment you think you have encompassed everything, the moment you forget that he knows what is before them and behind them, but they do not encompass it, is the exact moment you stop learning and start becoming a tyrant of your own unproven assertions.
It demands rigorous, exhausting epistemological discipline. You must remain an eternal student of the system.
You can never graduate.
No, you must possess the cognitive restraint to say, I have this piece of data, but I will not rush to judgment until I see how it integrates with the rest of the systemic code.
It is the ultimate antidote to the hot take culture. It forces you to prioritize long-term truth over short-term ideological victory.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, and we really need to look at the total architecture we've uncovered.
Let's pull all of this together. Think about the journey we just took in this deep dive.
It's been a ride.
We started with this spooky, gothic, mythological image of Judgment Day ghostly whispers, terrified people, and towering thrones.
And we have decoded that linguistic placeholder into the ultimate baseline for absolute cognitive discipline and data integrity.
We saw how the entrenched mountains of power and corporate monopoly are blasted into a level plane of transparency, Kwan Saf Safa, where corruption cannot hide.
We saw how the deafening PR spin and loud propaganda of corrupt systems are instantly silenced into a whisper by the objective, empirical truth of the caller.
We entirely dismantled the superstitious idea of intercession.
The VIP pass.
Right. And we replaced it with a strict software compatibility check, where only the raw data of your actions actually matters.
We established that a constructive society must eradicate Zulm and Had.
It can never, under any economic model, devalue human labor or distort equity.
Because the law of requital records every single action in a closed information loop, and the consequences are mathematically inevitable.
And finally, we championed reason and intellectual humility. We learned to never rush the data, to avoid the tyranny of confirmation bias, and to constantly seek an increase in knowledge.
We have essentially laid out the complete economic, legal, and intellectual rules for a perfect systemic society.
But this raises a vital, almost haunting question that we cannot ignore.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
If the rules are this clear, if the social physics of cause and effect are this irrefutable, if the economic playing field has been theoretically leveled and the intellectual boundaries established, why is humanity so structurally prone to forgetting these systemic lessons?
That's the great tragedy.
And why do we keep, generation after generation, rebuilding the mountains of monopolies? Why do we keep falling for the loud PR spin?
It makes no logical sense.
Why do we keep exploiting the desperate laborers at the crossroads, knowing it will eventually collapse our own society?
Exactly. Why do we keep crashing the system?
It's madness.
To answer that, the text takes us all the way back to the foundational psychology of human civilization. It takes us to the prototype archetype of human consciousness itself, Adam.
Oh, wow.
In Lecture 12 out of 14, covering Ayat 115, we are going to do a deep dive case study into a single explosive verse detailing the primal failure of human resolve and the true anatomy of cognitive amnesia.
We're going to look at the exact mechanism of how humanity forgets the code.
We will explore the prototype of failure so we can finally understand how to succeed.
That is going to be an incredible conversation. So, for now, to you listening, leave the ghosts and the mythological terrors behind. Instead, ask yourself, what kind of code are you writing with your actions today? Are you aligning with the permanent values, or are you hoping for a VIP bypass that doesn't exist? Think about that ledger. See you in the next deep dive.